for coming today. I'm going to have our panel participants here introduce themselves shortly, but I just want to say very shortly thank you to Isto for a very fine presentation. Thanks. And it's going to be very nice to hear a little bit more about kind of how we can talk about Paradata more in the context of our research in certain fields, and also from our perspective, how can we also think about it as how can we use it in training, in incorporating into research methodologies, how we can kind of maybe potentially use it as a good concept for improving our work as well as researchers. So to start with, I would just ask Anna Maria to present yourself a little bit about your work, and maybe reflect very shortly about kind of what you heard today and on the Paradata concept for you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, hello everyone, I am Anna Maria, and I am a PhD student here at RITMO. I am at my final year, and I am working on multimodal processing of music data. So this is very relevant for me in my work. I have found myself wondering what is important to document and what is important to include in not only data management plans, but also when we publish a data set itself. And when we analyze data, so it's very important to have these distinctions of the structures of our data and what is the core and what describes the core and what is around the creation of everything. So, yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. I found it very relevant to my work.
Yeah. Agata?
Hi everybody, I'm Agata Bochynska. I work both with research and research support. So I'm a little bit in a sort of double role here. I'm affiliated with the section for open research here at the University of Oslo Library. And so I teach a lot about how to make research shareable, how to make research more transparent, and the concept of documentation and metadata is of course at the very core of what we are teaching, and sort of documenting research processes and providing context information when you share data. But the Paradata concept is actually very new to me, so I'm more than happy to learn more too.
Steinar?
Hi everyone, my name is Steinar Solheim, and I'm an associate professor in archaeology at the Museum of Cultural History, which is the university museum here in Oslo. I spend quite a lot of time working with archaeological excavations, obviously, and reading and writing field reports. So I've been very concerned in how we can improve the methodologies that we use in archaeology and excavations, and especially trying to raise awareness on the choices that we make during excavations and how this, again, is reflected in the field reports. And well, as I said during the break, I kind of felt really home in this presentations, but I can see that we still have some work to do with our reports as well, so this was really interesting. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, great. So, Isto, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about kind of some of the overlap that we have with some of these different concepts around the Paradata, metadata, provenance, and these sorts of things. Could you say a little bit more about kind of what you've seen in the fields about kind of how this terminology is received, or the concept is received? Then we're talking with some of the researchers out in the field and how they relate to it. With maybe like, is it a confusion? Is it does it help add clarity to the project? How do they kind of react to the kind of when you're coming with that concept and talking about it to them in your field work or in other presentations you've held?
Yeah, I guess kind of in my field work, so it's been kind of mostly useful not to talk about Paradata, but to talk about kind of how you document your work, or what do you need to know about the kind of the origins or the making or the processing or something of the data sets that you're trying to use. But I guess kind of there are kind of then when I'm actually talking about Paradata, so then there are kind of certain let's say kind of typical ways of reacting to it, and kind of one way is that there's kind of a bunch of literature where there's quite a lot of this kind of an idea that, okay, kind of, yes, we need to, when we have data, so then we need to have metadata, and then we need to kind of have also Paradata. Sometimes in survey research, the people have a fairly good idea what they actually kind of want when they refer to Paradata. In in archaeology and heritage context, so it's become a little bit kind of a sort of a topos that you are kind of saying that yes, and then we have to take care of the metadata and paradata, full stop, without kind of really elaborating kind of okay, what is that needs to be done. But there is clearly it kind of sort of signals of something kind of that okay, kind of the current metadata standards or the current practices are not really kind of doing good enough job to capture everything that needs to be captured. So kind of that far you get. Then there is of course kind of this kind of an idea that yes, kind of but kind of don't come and talk to me about paradata because kind of it's already in metadata, in provenance data, in kind of pick your favorite concept and it's kind of already there. But I'm a kind of my take is really that I'm kind of talking about paradata maybe kind of not as a kind of a new kind of data per se, but more like kind of it's a way of talking about certain things that would be good to document, and a whole lot of that information is really in metadata already, or in the data, or in many other places. But kind of when we have a sort of an umbrella term, so then we can maybe kind of more like kind of sort of frame or kind of identify what needs to be done.
Right. Does anybody have a comment to that? Maybe Steinar, you said that there's kind of maybe some room for improvement in your fieldwork.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I've been kind of preparing for this discussion, I've been thinking about what is Paradata and how does it relate to what we're doing. And as you demonstrated or showed during your presentation, I also think that we find this information kind of throughout our reports or throughout the different parts of the report. It's not like it's kind of it's not in one specific part of archaeology or the documentation that we're doing, but it kind of seeps throughout all parts of it in a way. As you were saying, you can find it in the pictures, or you can find it in the information from the total stations, or in the different parts like the methods part of the field reports and so on. And I also think that, as you mentioned, that it doesn't have to be like Paradata. Doesn't have to be like very strict kind of strict information or strict data set in a way, which I kind of find very appealing to how we are doing archaeology and how we report excavations. And yeah, I'm not going to. Sorry, I'm going to be. It was archaeology, so I'm getting a bit excited now. But of course, this is very important for what we're doing because we are removing our source material. So we need to be explicit on the choices that we are doing when we are excavating. So this is something I'm going to start talking about at the museum a lot.
Agata?
Yeah, okay, so maybe I'll be playing a little bit of a devil's advocate in this panel. I'll be pushing back a little bit. Yeah. So I've been thinking about this, and throughout your lecture, I've been also reflecting on the need of the term paradata, right? Because you just mentioned that when you're talking to researchers, sometimes it's better to drop the concept or the term paradata and just talk about documentation in general. And we have been talking about documentation in the sort of data management world, open science world, data sharing context. And of course, the big question is, do we need the term paradata, or can we just talk about documentation? And then there is the second really interesting thing that you mentioned, which is that the concept of metadata is sort of not there to capture everything that we need to capture in that sort of broad documentation. So we need paradata. And then my question is sort of like, well, what if we further develop the concept of metadata to also include that? So sort of my pushback is coming from the place of talking to researchers very often about these things when they don't know, they have no idea about information science research that is sort of looking into these terms. They don't care what these things are being called, right? They only care about preparing their data in a useful way for reuse, and so this is why the really central question for me is whether we need that term at all, or whether we can just pack everything. Maybe we can even drop metadata. Maybe we can just pack everything into just research documentation, right?
Do you have a comment to that before I let Isto answer that question?
I think it's an interesting question because I also have seen that when we talk about how to document and how to publish data sets, we need to distinguish different types of data. And how do we distinguish and where do we draw the lines in different types of data? People get more confused. But I thought if I contextualize this to my work, I also work with machine learning. So when we do distinctions of data types, it helps a lot when we analyze. So it will be difficult to communicate new terms and help people understand where to draw the lines. But usually this categorization and this splitting up of your information is very helpful in many things you do in everyday research and analysis.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I'll let you then, Isto.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a very good point, and I'm definitely not kind of the one. Okay, I've done it a little bit myself. I have to admit, it's kind of in introducing a new kind of concept. Not that much people kind of do in science studies, where every article needs to kind of introduce a new concept. Though I hope, but kind of. I would say that, no, we don't need Paradata concepts. We could only talk about documentation. But in a way, when I was referring to that, when I'm interviewing or talking to people, when they kind of tell about their needs and what they kind of how it plays out in their work. So I'm not talking about information either, because it all of these words, they kind of sort of trigger responses, and they might not be the responses that I'm most interested in. Metadata, it quite easily gets you, okay, I need to kind of document who did, kind of data creator, and then we have to have a kind of a lot of keywords, and that's it. And then kind of sort of the thinking stops there. So kind of mentioning Paradata, so okay, people might not have an idea, but they try to kind of desperately figure out what it could mean for me to be able to kind of give such answers that I would like, sort of. So in that sense, I'm not using analytical terms when I'm talking to people, when I'm trying to kind of get you to tell me something interesting. But I agree with you that in a sense, kind of pointing out that there is something that needs to be done, a part of the documentation that's maybe a kind of sort of not well thought through in standards or especially maybe kind of in practice how kind of things are done. So it's sort of useful if you can give it a name. But that's I guess, and what I don't like is kind of that we need metadata and we need Paradata. No, it doesn't really kind of work like that. At least as I think.
So would then Paradata include also metadata? So in your view, because you say we don't need metadata and Paradata, so but of course the concept of metadata is out there, and then we have the concept of Paradata. So how would they relate to each other in an ideal world, right?
Yeah. I think that we could have the concepts absolutely, but kind of not kind of as two distinct types of descriptors or distinct types of document. Okay, maybe kind of distinct types of documentation. No, because a lot of Paradata about kind of information that tells us about processes, it's really in the metadata already. Many metadata standards contain quite a lot of information that's quite useful as Paradata. But then there is much more. That's kind of outside of what's in, let's say, conventional metadata standards, and much more things that ever should actually kind of go into metadata standards. And these are these kind of, let's say, more kind of unstructured things and things that are maybe not as kind of clearly Paradata for everybody, but that could kind of inform somebody about the process. So I think there should be a fair kind of bunch of formal descriptors, formal documentation, especially to make things findable. And then there should be kind of all kinds of leftovers to make it usable for those who have already found it and kind of need to really kind of understand it, because kind of metadata has certain limitations how much it can help you to understand things, because it's so formal and it needs to follow certain principles that are not kind of really that this kind of sort of getting me to grab it all.
But you also pointed to that issue where people say you need to document your work, but they don't exactly discuss what that documentation necessarily entails, documenting the process of gathering data and how it was collected. And maybe that also, I think they'll call it in some qualitative research is like that's positionality of the researcher in the research, and I think that some of that is integrated into kind of the methods of a lot of how this research and maybe the epistemology of some of that research that we're talking about here. But so I lurer på, or I wonder, sorry, I'm in Norwegian mode. So I wonder if the Paradata concept is helpful in that we could use it as a way of kind of reanalyzing some of our methods, and kind of how can we better document processes? Maybe that was not really a question, more of a comment. But so do you have any kind of thoughts about that?
Yes, I think definitely that's quite true. The Paradata can definitely help us to be kind of critical and to understand what we ourselves do.
Yeah. And maybe you can also see a little bit about kind of in the archaeological context.
Well, yeah, I think it's a good concept that it can make us become increasingly aware of how we collect the data, and basically, well, a lot of what we are doing as archaeologists in the field is kind of this silent knowledge or tacit knowledge. We're not kind of explicit on what we're doing, the choices that we're doing, how we're doing it, and so on. So, not that we need to introduce a new kind of concept, but I think it's good to kind of to make us a bit more aware on our practices in a way.
Do you have an example of where that might fit into archaeology?
Yeah, well, I'm mainly working with Stone Age excavations, and we have what we call we have a standardized way of excavating a Stone Age site in square meters, basically. And when we do this, we refer to as the normal way, the normal method for excavating a Stone Age site. As you mentioned, methods are changing with certain intervals in a way, but all archaeologists in Norway at least would kind of know what we are referring to now at this point, but not necessarily 50 years.
Right.
Correct. So.
What in the context of musicology then?
Well, I was just thinking that there's two reasons why you should document these things, and one is for the future you, which is something we argue a lot at RITMO. So if you go back to this and you have no idea how you process things, what kind of tools did you use, what kind of frame rates, sample rates, and everything when you process audio or video, then you go back to this documentation you remember. But also it's important for people who want to replicate your work. And this is something that just came to my mind when we publish about, okay, we analyzed this corpus of music and we did this and that to the audio and the video. We put this under methods or when we describe the data, but it's in a different section than saying, okay, metadata has this and this description. So it could be, okay, metadata, this, and paradata, the process of creating this. So it would be a very detailed and very structured documentation for other people to reproduce exactly what we did and with the tools we use. And for annotations, maybe we can include like disagreement cases and things we thought that didn't work that are also very useful in many of our cases. So, yeah.
And Agata, in your work with qualitative data and kind of that context-sensitive information, how making that, do you have any kind of thoughts around that?
There was one example that really spoke to me from your talk that maybe applies to any field research, but a lot of qualitative researchers, of course, work in the field. And this is documenting your work or your research process through pictures and videos. And it reminded me of this conversation with my collaborator lately, where the collaborator was doing a sort of part of the research process, and I said, well, can you do a screencast of how you're doing it so that we have the exact, like all the steps, how this is done? And then they were like, oh, no, I will just describe the procedure. And then I thought there's a huge difference between these two things in terms of the sort of ease of understanding and the accessibility of that procedure. And I think that kind of way of documenting research process is incredibly useful through videos and pictures. And then an interesting thing is that maybe if we do call it Paradata, all these videos and images, that also pushes researchers to organize them differently. Something that was mentioned that, okay, maybe then we're a bit more disciplined in organizing that kind of documentation. It's not just a pile of videos and here's all the documentation of the research process, but here's a data set with the paradata of this research process, and maybe it gets us to think differently. And again, maybe that's not very specific to qualitative research, but especially in qualitative research, this context information and this situatedness of research and this context specificity is so important for not necessarily you reuse always, because it's not always feasible to reuse that kind of research, but understanding the process of what happened and opening that black box of the research process. So that's maybe an interesting argument for sort of forcing researchers to structure their documentation a bit better and treat it as data items, basically, and not just a pile of information that they will throw out.
Yeah.
A small comment on the documenting through videos and pictures. I had this weird ambition or goal a bit before to characterize a big dataset with different types of data through a picture or a figure. And I was so impressed that actually someone managed to do it in another field, documenting the process of ending in a final product or so on. So I was thinking we could summarize it all through a nice picture with the help of generative technologies and so on, and document the whole process in just the picture that summarizes, okay, this data set is like this and this is how it all happened, which is kind of ideal, but I was impressed to see it, a small example of it in other fields. So that would also save a lot of time for us and for other people reading what we did and everything, so they can just have a quick overview of, this processes.
Cool. I was also thinking with the archaeology too, you're saying that some of the paradata is kind of spread out through the material. Is this something that could provide value for you as an archaeologist?
Yeah, absolutely. But I just want to follow up on that.
For sure.
Documentation with pictures, because as shown in the presentation, we are using photos a lot during fieldwork. We start with kind of documenting the site as it is before we start, and then kind of taking pictures of almost everything during the process. And at the end of the excavation, we have, say, 1,000 pictures. And you talked about too much documentation.
Yeah.
So when we get back and doing the post-excavation work, we have to sort this. So I mean, but we can reconstruct the process, and we can reconstruct the site in a way. But we also we're doing we're selecting which pictures that is actually usable for this, and then we add them to the database, and the rest will be kind of either deleted or put somewhere else. So
Yeah.
I think also touching on that issue of how much documentation is too much or how much is too little, that's also absolutely critical, and that's a sort of common problem to however we call it too, whether we talk about Paradata, documentation, metadata. I think this is a huge issue to tackle, and that we should be also talking more about that. What is sort of most feasible, most sustainable way of documenting research, and again, like preventing that sort of unstructured information dump, but really thinking about the usefulness. I think as a researcher making that call, should I delete 50 or 500 pictures from that 1,000 pile? That's a very difficult call to make sometimes. And what is most useful for the future me, other people? I think that's something that we've been struggling with a lot.
Okay, Amelia.
And I had a question about this, because you talked about Paradata being very contextualized. So depending on the case and the research goal and the field, we will use different types of data as the main data and the rest as description and so on. So if we say that, okay, I publish this as my data or Paradata, but someone else is interested in some aspect that we find is too much, then how do we deal with that? Because exactly all of this information that for us is extra or paradata or that we don't want to share, for some other people would be actual data or actual information.
Isto?
Yeah, well, you can't. Okay, you deal with it as you kind of deal with it in cases when there is no data. You hope that the thing happened kind of maybe 5 years ago when you still remember what you did. It didn't happen kind of 10 years ago when you have forgotten, or 100 years ago when you are not here anymore. And but even in those cases, kind of. I think that it's been kind of interesting in working with archaeologists in a sense, because kind of sort of archaeologists are kind of really anxious about documenting their practices, but at the same time, the whole kind of what is archaeology is all about. It's about kind of trying to figure out how things were done in the past, where we only have a kind of a few kind of very little evidence, very fragmentary, very kind of something that's not quite enough, and we can still say quite a lot about what people did on in kind of during Stone Age. So kind of there is sort of hope anyway. So kind of don't be kind of too anxious about that. But of course, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be kind of doing good enough to try to do good enough job right now. Kind of in documenting, and especially in documenting in ways that you think that might be relevant.
No, but I think it's a valid question. What is good enough
Definitely.
too?
Yes,
like, how do you, right?
I think that also depends a little bit on kind of that epistemological distance that you're talking about as well. It's like how can I know as an innovation entrepreneurship researcher about musicology? Like how do I know what is going to be important for them if they're going to reuse my data for some weird reason? But also like that idea of like that diversity of transparency concept you talked about, and how that might vary also from field to field, and what that might mean. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of what you meant with that, the diversities of transparencies concept?
Yeah, kind of. Yes, definitely. I think kind of what I'm mostly referring to is that kind of when we decide to document certain things and document them in certain ways. So we hopefully aim at achieving something with it, and what we're aiming to achieve is that we try to create certain types of transparencies. It could be kind of that we try to explain things, so kind of, or it could be that we try to make something understandable, or we can try to make something reproducible, some kind of a process, or the research that can be redone. We could try to kind of sort of convince that kind of trust me, I've done this properly, or many other things. But then also kind of partly kind of when we do this, so we achieve what we try to do, but then we also achieve a little bit other things, and we might not be kind of fully achieving what we want to do. So kind of in that sense, they kind of go a little bit onto each other. So from the perspective of somebody who kind of reads or consults the documentation that we have created, so the yes, it's mostly maybe a kind of what we intended, but only partly, and you can see much more there. But the decisions that we make as documenters, so they're having an impact on kind of what is kind of doable with a documentation. And here, I guess, kind of, let's say the method section in research articles are a good example in a way, because they kind of there's a sort of an idea that we're supposed to be kind of describing what we did, but it's not really that much about it. It's not to make the research kind of reproducible directly, but it's more like to kind of give an idea about, let's say, kind of about our episteme, and then what is of course kind of extremely important is that kind of when a person reads the methods, so they can kind of sort of tick the checkbox and that okay, kind of yes, this work was done properly enough, so that I can kind of sort of trust on the results and I can use it for whatever I'm interested in using them.
I don't have a follow-up totally question about that, but I think that was really kind of nice to say. But I think we also have met that a lot with like when our research around qualitative research and kind of the idea of reproducibility in that field. It varies quite a lot, and there's a lot of resistance or actually just outright it's like this isn't relevant for the type of research that I'm doing, but that I think Paradata is a nice concept in that it kind of bridges that. We still need to document that research, regardless of whether or not it's going to be for reproducibility for other purposes. It's for future people to kind of understand what's been going on in that research as well. Now I'm going to take a little bit of kind of a selfish question and kind of pose it to the group a little bit, which is going to talk a little bit about kind of how can we incorporate some of this concept. Maybe not. I mean, we could use the term directly and start using Paradata and combining it with the different other concepts we talk about. But how can we start incorporating this into some of our training around kind of getting PhD students, postdocs, and even researchers who maybe aren't familiar with it, like how can we start kind of incorporating this kind of a concept into documenting the process of research into our training systems, our research education systems? Any suggestions, Anna Maria?
I think first of all, we need to convince people that this is something that is helping them and that is useful for them. Because if you just say that, okay, you have to do this, I find it also at RITMO we have these lab meetings, and when we do these data management plans, it's so chaotic. It's so many things you need to fulfill in order to have this plan. So adding another layer would be overwhelming. So I think you have to convince people, as we do in publications, that you have to describe your data. You need to describe this process because it helps you, and because it helps your research, and because it makes you and your research products more accessible or more available. And yeah, as long as we give this mindset to people, things will flow a bit better.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, Steinar?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you, but I also think that we should do this at an even earlier stage already, at the master's or maybe even at the bachelor level, because this kind of also relates to open research, of course, and sharing of data in general. And this is something we need to raise more awareness of this for students when they're starting their data collection for their master's degree and so on. This is part of the package. This is how we should do research. Should do science anyway. You also need to kind of describe the choices that you make when you're collecting your data. So I think this. We're not teaching at the museum. We're doing excavations, obviously. Yeah. So it's easy for me to say, but I think this is something that should come in at quite an early stage, at least. Yeah.
Any reflections on that, Isto?
Yeah, I guess kind of what would be kind of definitely. I would kind of definitely start with the students and not kind of grey-haired professors, because kind of they or we are lost. But yes, definitely I would kind of go with that kind of that. Okay, kind of yes, this is important. This is and especially kind of this is useful, and this is kind of interesting, and maybe kind of starting with something kind of in the beginning of your career. So I guess kind of, or remembering back, so kind of it can be difficult to kind of see kind of the data management plan or the data collection that I'm about to start. So what is going to happen after that? But kind of sort of trying to clarify that kind of certain things are impossible to do with a data set if you kind of don't have this kind of information, making it as kind of concrete as possible so it could be useful, and then also kind of extending it to that kind of think about your own data in 5 years. It kind of might sound very kind of a distant idea that you might have any interest in your data at that point, but if you don't kind of describe what you did, so as you said, so you don't have a clue what happened, and then you can't kind of even use your own stuff. And that might be kind of sort of that, okay, kind of, oh, I probably kind of should be kind of doing that.
Agata?
Yeah, I will keep pushing for for that terminology issue in this context, of course, because I think what's really important is harmonizing how we are talking about these things. I think it is a big issue that in the whole, that whole world of research transparency and data management and data sharing, that all these early career researchers will go to one institution and there they will learn about discipline-specific metadata or sort of documentation processes, and then they will go to RITMO and they will learn about Paradata, right? And then they're like, I think I heard about this concept, but it was not called that. And that's a huge issue. It's not only around Paradata. It's a huge issue around how we use the terminology related to these sort of meta research items or research objects, or how we talk about research processes. And I think it is really important for us, sort of behind the scenes, to harmonize how we talk about these things and harmonize how we teach these things, so that when we go out to researchers, we don't meet, confusion and frustration, but we can be a bit more unified on that front towards implementing more transparency in research and more sharing where possible, and also to adjust that to different disciplines. I think some of the things you talked about, which is really important, is that epistemic diversity in research, or that sort of specific needs for Paradata, or for specific types of Paradata across different disciplines, and I think that's also important, so that we go with that, we go out to the researchers with that awareness of what is that discipline, what that discipline needs, what are the typical types of data in that discipline, and what kinds of documentation or Paradata or metadata is that particular type of data going to need, or that particular type of research process. So I think I would sort of push for disciplining us more, sort of before we go out to researchers and teach them about these concepts. At the same time, I think that, of course, many researchers are perfectly capable in understanding. Oh, okay. These things are being described maybe slightly differently, but those are really important things that I need to do and I need to incorporate in my practice. And here I completely agree that we need to present that sort of need for documentation as something that is very useful for researchers themselves, and this is what's going to convince them to start using it.
Cool. Now I'm thinking I can open up to the floor if there's any kind of questions or comments that people like to have. Finn?
Well, along this line, from my personal experience, the best lessons I got on documenting data is trying to use other data sets. And I think some confusion that I've had in engaging with this conversation is that it's a lot of information about what someone should do in the process of making a data set, when the kind of practicalities of it really hit when you see what's left over from someone else's work.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can talk about how to negotiate that, and where we might build in maybe the future user's experience in a more tangible way to help us maybe clarify our priorities as we do this kind of work.
Yeah. Isto, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess kind of it's really quite a lot about kind of a question of that you should maybe kind of try to have that experience by yourself. It's very difficult, but kind of doing as you said that you have done, kind of in a way. Okay, you can kind of somebody who hasn't ever tried to reuse data before, so it's really difficult to know how to do it, and kind of where the kind of the important small things are that you should be kind of really thinking about. So kind of some sort of an exercise of trying to make sense of something that's pretty badly documented, and then kind of sort of maybe adding up a little bit more documentation, and then kind of having this kind of a revelation of how it kind of really works. Otherwise, we can of course we can make guidelines, and we can kind of tell people what to do, and we can get quite far with that as well. And I think that's kind of course that's maybe kind of the first thing to do, because kind of this might be a little bit kind of too advanced and too kind of time consuming that everybody would be doing this. Okay, kind of from this moment on, so we should maybe kind of teach every student to kind of do certain things, but kind of considering that it's not going to happen in practice because of the differences between the different places where people are working on. And then especially kind of when you move from one environment to another, so even if there are some kind of basic principles that I think that definitely should be harmonized. So then there are many differences in kind of what kinds of transparencies really are the most important ones in different disciplines and different, let's say, kind of research epistemes, research cultures, and when it's really kind of relevant to talk about data, and when which cases you kind of it's best not to talk about it because it doesn't really make that much any sense, and kind of using certain words and so on. So kind of coming out from this kind of a little bit, our data management model is very much coming from the natural sciences and medicine, where kind of things really need to be reproducible, because we need to kind of get 1,000 people to kind of be studied on, let's say, kind of one medicine to see kind of if it really works. In humanities, social sciences, so it's more like the knowledge is cumulative, and data is kind of, we look into the data set and then we analyze it, and then the outcomes, they are compared to the outcomes of and results of other research. So kind of it doesn't, we can kind of sort of, it needs to be a combination of kind of learning stuff kind of really by yourself and figuring out how to do things, but then also kind of a little bit of kind of sort of pushing.
Sounds like a nice task for a masterclass or something like that.
Yeah.
To maybe add to that, I think that academics should really get much more into a user testing mindset. In many industries, no objects or outputs would be released without user testing first. And so if I create a data set that for reuse, maybe I should send it to 2 or 3 academics, maybe from other disciplines first, so that I can check with them, is this reusable? Would you understand if I give you this documentation, and maybe I can ideally also pay them for their time of doing that, because we have also a really bad tendency of not doing that. But I think we shouldn't be maybe releasing something that we haven't really tested for reusability before we put it out there. And maybe that could partly solve...
and that might help also reduce that distance between data maker and data user as well. Yeah.
Although there's kind of one little thing, and it's when it comes to research data, is that kind of what we're really, when we are releasing research data, so what we want to happen is that somebody comes in and does something that we haven't ever been able to even think about that somebody could be doing with that data.
Yeah.
So in that sense, kind of, yes, I do agree that, yes, user testing, in a sense, kind of letting somebody else try to figure out what it's all about.
No, that would be like
So
kind
that
of
would be
minimal
wonderful.
user testing
Yes,
for
exactly.
whether this is understandable information at all, right?
Yeah.
Whether the minimum requirements for understanding what's in that data set are out
Kind
there.
of a pre-curation for data
Yeah,
curation.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Peer review of the data for reusability.
I kind of think a little bit, but this is a bit of a question that kind of, yes, it's good to document, but kind of and good to think that user testing is really useful, but then not kind of going into this kind of mindset that you can document all, or you can kind of solve all the problems by user testing.
Or making it clear that you're not just going to clean the data as well, making it pretty.
Yeah.
Federico, you had a question?
Yes, so I have a question about the technical representation and implementation of Paradata and how it is done. So I was wondering if it would work as metadata when you have a schema and you know which types you're supposed to use and which ontologies, and if this is the case, and this also connects again to what Agata was mentioning earlier, whether it actually makes sense to call them a different object, say Paradata instead of just metadata, and then the metadata is modular and you have a section in this metadata that is more oriented towards Paradata and provenance. And then, but I was also, because I was, so we're maintaining a bit an ontology, and in this ontology actually we have some classes which are data classes and some that are operation classes, and actually there are operations, sorry, there are properties connecting these, like an operation as an input, and it has a data input, and as an output, and that's another one. So that's another maybe a bit abstract way of actually representing Paradata. So I was wondering whether this could also be a standard way of representing these properties ontology-wise.
Isto, probably?
Yeah, I think kind of it can be done in different ways, and it really depends on kind of which field, what kind of purpose the Paradata should have. And I guess kind of, yes, it would be very useful to kind of sort of ingest Paradata in formal metadata to an extent to make the datasets findable according to the method or certain tools or perspectives, if that's kind of a sort of what kind of research it is all about. So I think it should definitely kind of find its place there. But then when it comes to that, when you have found an interesting dataset, so then other means are probably more useful, and it could be anything from photos or videos to kind of a formal workflow, either computational or non-computational, that would be kind of attached to that dataset to describe how it was done. But that's more like a kind of a question of how, let's say, kind of the research and data practice work in specific fields. What would be the most appropriate way of doing? If it's very much about kind of reproducibility, so then it would be kind of more formal. If it's more like that, it's kind of where things are not being kind of done that much kind of in this kind of a formal procedure. So then I guess kind of more kind of less formal ways of expressing things might be kind of more useful.
Cool. So another question, I think as Camilla first, and then.
Yes. Hi, I'm from the other university. So I'm employed as a digital humanities researcher at Oslo Met, but nowadays most of my time I'm part of a team that works with creating an research infrastructure for working with digital materials at Oslo Met. So that's my work, and a lot of the time I spend helping social scientists grapple with materials from the net and creating data sets that they can carry analysis with and creating workflows with that. And the reason I do that is my digital humanities background, and especially like collections as data, part of the GLAM sector. And there has been this, for the last years, this movement of data sheets for data sets. And then in Europe and then in the US or the Americas, you have the responsible data sets in context movement that are writing data essays. And you're seeing, like, especially in the fields that deal with digitized collections or born digital material from the net, you have also these kind of best practices or data sheets, like here, this is what you need to write down to show how you made this data set into a data set. And I was wondering because it was very interesting when we talked about Paradata, because I never see that term come up in those movements, but there are very established practices for creating data sheets or data essays. Which is basically Paradata. So are you talking with each other? And the other question, perhaps there's kind of like some fields that we're used to handling this type of data. It becomes perhaps more natural and it becomes more established. And again, is it that easily transferable? Like the data sheets, they work for certain data, but perhaps not for everything.
Yes, I'm fully aware of that, and it's kind of and I'm not the only one talking about Paradata, but yes, kind of these communities are kind of sort of overlapping and knowing of each other, and this is a little bit kind of the question of what terms we should be using and what we shouldn't be using, and what is the background. So it's kind of playing out there, but I think there are kind of quite useful tools and kind of sort of techniques how to kind of capture and represent this kind of information then in many data documentation standards. So we have all the means to represent all different kinds of Paradata in formal ways. We just want if we would be doing it, and if we would be prepared to kind of use really the means to do that. But what is kind of maybe a little bit, it is kind of in many of these descriptions or these standards and instructions how to kind of create a data sheet, for instance, there are also data cards and many other other kind of comparable things, and you could ask kind of why datasheet isn't enough, but you need to have a data card as well. But the question is really that they don't necessarily kind of tell you that much kind of how you should be doing the things, and it is really kind of there the problem is, not really in kind of that there wouldn't be technical means to kind of represent stuff, how to kind of do that. So that's really a question that there are communities where kind of, let's say, Paradata is more or less kind of, it's not maybe called Paradata, but it's a solved problem. There's always kind of astronomers, they are doing kind of fine. They have a kind of a common global data set that everybody is using. Although there is a lot of kind of research done on very small data sets that don't actually kind of follow any standards. So yes and no. There are good examples, but what is kind of the anecdotal good examples tend to be that there's a community of researchers that kind of really think in the very same way. So they know exactly what they have to tell in order to kind of sort of everybody around the table understand what's going on. And these are not very useful in a sense, because then we kind of we can sort of communicate around the table, but we don't get any farther. So yeah.
But it's just interesting when you say the difference between the how and the what.
Yeah.
Like what? Because if the purpose is for the data set to be reused, but then you can reuse it for in whatever way you like, then what has been done for what is in it is the most important. But if you want to replicate it, then the how is more important, and perhaps that is the
Well, we'll have an hour after this if you have time to talk. Well, we have 2 more questions. We're going to be going a little over time for those of you who need to go, so feel free to leave. But we'll take a question from Kayla and you as well.
This is a question more, I guess, for all of you about data provenance. Is a lot of times the data that you capture on the hard device is not the data that you actually use. And then when we talk about documentation and efficiency of documentation is like the line between what's helpful from the original form and the usable form. What's too far? Could you just describe like what was just a little bit too much information in different projects that you've seen in getting to that usable form?
Anybody like to comment?
I feel like there are 2 questions here. So, because one thing is about the sort of raw data and then transformed data.
You have raw data,
and
it's a lot of times has to be transformed into usable data.
Yeah.
And the usable data is what you use. So the documentation of that transformation into different steps is a lot of times necessary for somebody to replicate it, but like to a point.
Yeah, I would always say that the minimal amount of information that would allow another person to repeat this process, right? Like describing all the steps that are necessary to follow exactly the same procedure. And it doesn't mean that they will be maybe doing it, but by being able to repeat something, that sort of means the person understood what happened in this process, right? But at the same time, I think it definitely speaks to this issue that we were talking about, like what amount of documentation is too much and what amount of documentation is enough. And then Isto said, like, okay, as long as you do it well enough. And then this is something that we very often say, but I'm wondering if there is any concrete answer to that without talking about one specific data set or one specific research process. I don't know.
I mean, I'm not on the panel, but I can maybe also, I wonder.
No, Matthew, by all means.
But I'm wondering if there's also, like, in that transformation, what impact does that have? I think that's kind of more the important aspect that you need to kind of, what is the impact of that transformation on the data? I think that's kind of probably even more important kind of minimum that you need to document. This isn't necessarily that it needs to be repeated fully, but at least you acknowledging what impact that has on the data itself when you do get it, maybe.
I think for my field, I think it's too much documenting this transformation from raw data to something that I'm using, because what I'm sharing is almost never the raw data. So I would not expect people to replicate this because they don't have access to this. And most of the times it would be cleaning the noise or like cutting sections that are important for your work and so on. So I'm not sure if that would be something useful or relevant for all fields and all research cases. So already the whole process would be too much for my research, I think.
Cool.
But I think people should still understand, right? I think it's important that we still sort of transparently declare what was done,
happened.
but it's still a really valid question, like how much.
Yeah.
I don't think we answered it fully, but is there any?
Yeah, we're doing it all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of our excavation and in documentation, all the information is too detailed, basically.
Yeah.
What we can actually use when we're doing the interpretations. In many cases, not all the time, but yeah, that is a problem. But the kind of transformation from this kind of the raw data from the excavation compared to what is actually in the report or in the publication. Sometimes it's explained, sometimes it's not, but it's traceable at least somewhere in this process of database entry to the publication. Yeah.
I guess kind of the bare minimum would be to kind of say that something was kind of taken out. if it's a kind of noise was kind of sort of cleaned out, or we selected the kind of the let's say the relevant parts of the discussion. Okay, that's not
Whatever
very much,
that
but it's still
means,
something.
right?
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, but that would kind of be really the bare minimum, and I would really love to have a little bit more explanation.
Last final question.
Yes, just my question is sort of about the processes and documenting the processes, both in terms of generating the data, but also then cleaning and analyzing. Is that the processes are often quite messy. That they're sort of, especially when you're working in novel territory, it can be sort of zigzagging a bit and even going in circles a bit, and it's doing that generates the novel insight, and that might be worthwhile documenting. But then on the other hand, there's also a bit of this tension that in research and academia, you want to present yourself as credible. So you want to narrativize and say, okay, right, this and this and had this insight. And in a way, the documenting the messiness of the process might be a bit of a tension. So what are your thoughts on sort of, first of all, dealing with the messiness, but also with the tension there between the messiness and the credibility?
I'll start with you, Isto.
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is really no answer, but we should be kind of more comfortable with the messiness, and the whole academia should be kind of more. We all know that things don't go as it's documented in research publications, but we still kind of write them in the way that this is kind of a glorious kind of a battle that we won. And all research processes were clearly planned in the beginning, and then they kind of resulted in the results that we're anticipating. No, well, I hate to go to this kind of a university politics thing, but yes, we should be kind of really credited for kind of doing mistakes and not only kind of sort of allowed to do them, and yeah, publishing these kind of research procedures or kind of studies that didn't work out, kind of bad results, don't do this kind of things. So I think we should be kind of doing more of that.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what to say about this, but I mean, archaeological data it's messy and it's fragmented by nature.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of and how to deal with it. Of course, we're trying to present it in a bit more kind of a structured manner than it actually is, of course. But yeah, I don't know.
I couldn't say more better than Isto, so I will not add anything here.
Anna-Maria?
Yeah, I agree. I think I would really appreciate when I read papers to know what went wrong, because I try something else that I think they didn't do, and they probably did because I failed it. So like, it would be nice to know the things that you can't do or shouldn't try to do when you use someone else's data.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much to the panel, and thanks for the fine discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.